Hi, my name is Madeline Love, and today I'm going to be talking about visual versus verbal communication for my presentation 3, which is chapter 16 in our textbook. So visual versus verbal communication is the first thing I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what that means and what the difference between them is and why visual communication can be so important and useful. And the rest of these things kind of fall under that category. I'm going to talk about typefaces and fonts, and the difference between those words and what they actually mean and look like. I'm going to talk about charts and graphs, and I'll go over some examples of some charts and graphs and how to use them. I'm going to talk about icons and graphics, which are different from graphs and charts. Although they are very similar. And then I'm going to talk about using color in your presentation. All of these things make a presentation better and more effective. So visual versus verbal communication. Verbal communication is what people typically use. That's what I'm using right now. It's just words. But visual communication, which it's my PowerPoint here, it means using more than just words. So until recently, technical communication meant just technical writing because it was pretty expensive to use some of these things that we'll talk about here soon. But now visual communication has become increasingly important, and it's more widestream now that people have realized its importance. And audiences around the world may need to learn the material that we're going to talk about, which is why we're going to talk about international communication. People speak about the world as a global marketplace, which means that our information needs to be able to go around the world and be accessible. So technology must be accessible to people who speak a variety of languages, which is where our visual communication comes into play, because visual symbols can help make this possible. If you have pictures or the charts and graphs that we're going to talk about, it makes this information a lot more understandable to people who may not speak English. Even if there are English words on the screen, if we have little pictures here, they'll know what we're talking about. So computers and graphics. Before the personal computer and laser printer were widely available, fancy graphics were the domain of graphic artists. So there were people whose job was solely to sit around and make graphs and charts and fancy PowerPoints for you to be able to present your information in a way that is better and more visually attractive. But the drawback was that accurate charts or color graphics were expensive to produce because you had to go to a specialist to get them to create it. Now we have presentation software such as PowerPoint that makes creating presentations like this easy for everyone to do and fairly cheap. So visual communication is really important because humans think visually as a whole. So if you see a picture, your brain just processes it quicker and easier than if you have to read words, because of a thing called pre-attentive vision, which means that you process patterns globally at a glance, which is the actual definition, but that basically just means humans read each word and decipher it for verbal communication, but humans process visual communication as a large pattern. They perceive it quickly and efficiently, which is why we want to use visual communication instead of verbal communication. So next we're going to talk about typefaces and fonts. So before we jump into charts and other obvious visuals, let's talk about the visual elements of text itself. Because everyone uses typesetting, it's important for us to understand how to use fonts and typefaces effectively. So I'm going to talk about typeface and font and those definitions and what they actually look like. So typefaces is actually just the family of like the type, obviously, of font. So first we have serif, which basically means that there's like the little lines at the bottom of the letters, and then there's sans serif, sans meaning without in French. That one is just blocky. It's not going to have the little lines at the ends of our letters. And then there's somewhere in between. So these ones I actually have up here. This is Times New Roman. That's our basic serif. That's the one we use typically. And then the one that is without is Helvetica, which people don't typically use because it's boring and nobody likes boring. And then this somewhere in between option is called Optima. So here are our fonts. They refer to what the text is going to look like, not necessarily the what we typically would have thought of was font. What I thought of as font is actually typeface, the Times New Roman. But font, what we're going to call it is bold, italic, and then we have the bold italic. And here's the representations of those. So then some visual guidelines for how to actually incorporate that into your presentation. So when you're looking at typefaces, try not to mix type families. So don't go using Times New Roman and the plain ones like mix and match. Don't mix and match your typefaces. And use bold and italics sparingly because they'll get pretty convoluted, and they really should be used just to emphasize information. And if you go willy-nilly with bold and italics, it's going to look like everything's emphasized, and then that just kind of ruins the whole point of your bold or italics. It loses its effect. And the type size should be appropriate to room, layout, and audience. So that's something I haven't mentioned yet, actually, is your font size. So like this font size is actually 32. If it was too small, then you guys wouldn't be able to see it. If it was too big, it would take up way too much space on my slide. And also another tip for visual guidelines is don't overuse all caps. Same family as use bold and italics sparingly. So next we're moving on to charts and graphs. These are really good for presenting information. Charts and graphs can be particularly helpful in technical fields where information is often numerical. So like in your math classes, you will learn how to use charts and graphs because they're very important for presenting mathematical information. Charts can convey information in a way that is easily understood. So like here you see my bar graph go up and you know that means there's a rise in whatever this chart may be representing. So tables is a good visual choice when you are trying to show choices between different categories of information. So the guideline for that one is do not put too much information or too many words in your table, or it really takes away from what you're trying to do. Like this one's pretty straightforward. It has your cereal and the amount of iron from least to greatest. So yeah, that's a good example of a table that's not overdone. Bar charts and line graphs. A bar chart allows you to show trends and compare similar information. A good bar chart packs a lot of information into a concise format, and line graphs illustrate trends. So your guidelines for bar charts is that when you're giving a presentation, if you have a bar chart in a PowerPoint like this, you need your bars and your information to be visible from anywhere in the room. So next is pie charts and diagrams. Pie charts illustrate the relationship between the parts and the whole. So obviously when you're looking at a pie and a little slice of the pie tells you this information is like percentages and stuff. That's what you see pie charts used a lot for. And a good diagram is invaluable. So yeah, basically you would just learn better from visuals. And so now we're going to move on to icons and graphics. So one way to use icons is to substitute a small icon for your bullet points. Like the example from the textbook was putting little apples right here if you're giving a presentation on, say, Apple products. So that's what you want to follow. Your guideline for your icons is try and make sure that they actually make sense for what your topic is, instead of just putting apples on a presentation like mine. That wouldn't make much sense. It would just be an unnecessary little thing. So then graphics, they not only add life, but they can make complex ideas easier to understand. So graphics is what we say when we're talking about pictures. If you just have like a picture of a dinosaur, if you're trying to give a presentation on like paleontology and you're talking about how to put stuff like that together, a picture really makes a big difference. So for using color, selective uses of color can be very effective, because if you go putting color blobs all over the place, people are going to be looking at your color choices wondering why in the world you have color all over the place, instead of thinking about what you're trying to present, what information you want them to understand. And choosing the right color combination can actually be quite complex, so typically it's better to just stick with a little bit of color, like some green there. But color, really the guideline for that, it comes down to audience and purpose. Just like most things, when you talk about putting things on a presentation, you really got to take into account who you're presenting to and what you're trying to do. And the other big thing is that audiences typically enjoy color. Plain black and white is boring, and they're going to lose interest pretty quick in whatever you're trying to talk about. So in conclusion, visual communication, like we talked about, is more than about words. It's all about these things we've been talking about: pictures, graphics, charts, all that is visual communication. Different typefaces and fonts create different presentations, really. So if I had this whole thing in a different font, it might have given off a completely different vibe. So like my headings were in bold, and that really just draws attention to the fact that I'm introducing a topic. And I tried to make my font big enough to where you could see it. And then charts and graphics make a presentation interesting and more informative. If you really are trying to give a presentation all about the statistics about like drivers on the road or something, then having like a pie chart that tells you what percentage are different age groups or something like that, it really makes a big difference. And color gives a presentation life. So just having little splashes of color here and there keeps an audience engaged, makes sure that they care about what you're talking about instead of thinking that it's boring. And that's really all I have for today.